I want to talk about the way Man of Steel uses religion. A lot of people use the idea that Superman was always a Christian character or always supposed to reflect the character of Jesus to kind of justify what Man of Steel does. But I'd like to point out a few issues with that. Let's start off with a bit of a history lesson. As most people probably know by now, Superman was originally created by two young Jewish men named Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Most of you have probably also already seen the first version of Superman that the pair created. It wasn't exactly the same Superman we know now. So I kind of just wanted to touch on it briefly, but we're really going to start with basically where we would recognize Superman today. Superman is an immigrant. A young man who wants nothing more than to fit in and give back to the country and community that adopted him. He uses his powers and abilities to do what he believes is right and what he thinks will benefit society as a whole. And his creators were the sons of freshly immigrated Jewish families, trying hard amid harsh anti-Semitism and a difficult economic period to simply find their place and fit into American society. Doesn't it sound like that might make perfect sense? Most people who study this kind of thing know that if there's any religious context to the origin of Superman, it's Judaism. It's actually much closer to the origin of Moses than Jesus. But, apart from Moses being a guy who helps people and who was sent away in a basket as an infant to protect him, that's really about as far as you can draw the comparison. I'd like to throw my own hat in the ring and suggest there might even be some similarities between Superman and the Jewish folktale of the Golem. If you aren't familiar, the Golem is basically an unstoppable clay man animated to defend the oppressed Jewish people. It's invincible, super strong, driven by the will of the people. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? I'm not trying to put words in the creators' mouths or anything. I don't know if that really had anything to do with Superman's origins, but it's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, at least it sounds like a better fit than Jesus does. Early Superman really grew out of another character that Siegel and Shuster created called Slam Bradley. Superman was just kind of the next logical step. They drew on kind of grander mythologies and characters like Hercules, bringing them forward into the modern world. Actually, so far it doesn't really sound like there's much Christianity in there at all, does it? When does all that stuff come in? Well, it was a while after this. Yeah, as it turns out, Shuster may have had more than a casual interest in the idea of a person who's above the law and immune to pain, but really, really good at inflicting it. I don't want to be accused of rewriting history here. What actually happened was DC had just stolen the rights to Superman from Siegel and Shuster, so these kind of soft porn comics were largely done out of spite of that. However, I don't think you express your anger at DC in this way unless maybe there's a little something there to begin with. Looking back, it adds an interesting perspective on a character who's kind of the ultimate expression of S&M. But anyway, my main point is, early Superman basically wasn't much more than a relatively normal guy who went around scaring the crap out of bad guys, busting down doors, and doing good for his own self-satisfaction and what he thought would make the world a better place. Which really just sounds like your run-of-the-mill power fantasy, like the kind any group of oppressed people might have. Then came the 1950s. There is this thing called the Comics Code Authority that was formed in 1954 due to some very questionable Senate hearings and equally, if not more questionable works of psychologist Frederick Wortham. See, basically because of his book, Seduction of the Innocent, America thought that comic books were corrupting the youth, turning them into criminals and, sexual deviants and stuff. There was a scare, and because of that scare, Superman, like almost everything else in comics, kind of became stripped of anything that was deemed deviant or unchristian. You see where I'm going with this. Christianity is pretty Christian, but Jewish immigrants are decidedly not. Yeah, so Superman wasn't really compacted with hardcore Christian symbolism or analogies with Jesus until after the Comics Code Authority came into power. And that was through a history of betrayal, theft, and fear-mongering, because America. The character has been portrayed as Christian, and if it's done right, that really doesn't matter. I don't have an issue with it. His personal faith really doesn't matter, and I always thought that even when he is shown to be Christian, he does it in a New Testament way rather than an Old Testament because God says it's right kind of way. DC even officially confirmed Clark and the Kents as Protestant back in 2007. Although, you'd think if he was always meant to reflect Jesus, that would have been said a little bit sooner. Anyway, since the Comics Code Authority went away, the character is very much grown up, advocating his own humanistic, thoughtful version of morality. Superman's long since become an all-inclusive hero. It doesn't matter where you're from or what you believe. Superman stands for truth and justice, not for just America, but for the whole world, right? So then, what's my beef with Man of Steel? Well, remember, like I said, if it's handled respectfully, there's absolutely nothing wrong with making Superman a religious person, since, as a superhero, his belief obviously motivates him to do good. But Man of Steel commits a cardinal sin in this front. It gives Clark a trumped-up messiah complex, which is kind of the opposite of respectful. For example, look at the scene with Clark floating backwards out of the Kryptonian ship in the form of a crucifix. No, that's not a coincidence.
He's kind of this strange combination of Old Testament and New Testament.
He's also really telling his son that you are a god and you have the power.
I sometimes wonder if Russell Crowe was in this movie because he kind of looks for these religious roles lately. But look at the framing of this scene and Clark's expression. He's not just having fun as he backs out of the ship. Jor-El just gave him another one of these, Destiny speeches. So what this is Clark responding to Jor-El saying, "You're right, Father. I must save them all. I am their Messiah. I execute your will." As he kind of basks in his own self-righteous religious superiority. Here's the thing. This is not something Superman would ever do. See, you can make the Jesus analogy, or to any Messiah or Savior you like. Characters can too. Hell, even the writers can. But there's one person who can't. One person who can never, ever think of himself that way. And this should be obvious. That person is Superman himself. Because the Kents are supposed to teach him humility. They raised him to be genuinely humble and kind. Superman doesn't think of himself as a god. He more or less thinks of himself as a human man. And he actually gets pretty damn upset when other people make the comparison. Don't take my word for it. Here's a quote from Superman Batman number 3. "It is a remarkable dichotomy. In many ways, Clark is the most human of us all. Then, he shoots fire from the skies, and it's difficult not to think of him as a god. And how fortunate we all are that that does not occur to him." He doesn't want to be thought of that way, because if he did, he'd be an evangelical asshole with a messiah complex, not a spiritual leader. Let's take a look at another infamous scene where Clark turns to religion in Man of Steel. So, up until this point of the movie, we've been given no hint whatsoever that Clark is a religious person. This is actually right after he finds out he's an alien, implying, Christianity only exists on Earth. But anyway, so Clark decides a priest he's never met is who he needs to go to for advice about the Zod crisis. So, sure, let's say for a moment that, looking for fatherly guidance but without Pa Kent to turn to, Clark turns to a priest. Fatherly guidance. Wait, don't you still have one of those? Your undead, hologram, godlike ghost dad? He seems to have a lot to say about this subject, and he's, directly involved in the events. Wouldn't he be a better person to turn to? But maybe Clark needed a more human perspective? Okay. He's also got a human mother who's all about helping him out, and she seems pretty on the ball. I mean, this priest is a complete stranger, right? They don't know each other's names, they obviously don't recognize each other. This might even be the first time Clark's ever walked into a church. Now, this all could have been set up just fine by showing they had a close relationship before with the Kent family and the priest. Totally respectable if it's handled at least that well, kind of like it was in Daredevil. Instead, Clark has come to a complete stranger, who he's now admitted being Superman to, for advice about something the man clearly feels out of his depth discussing, and has only the most superficial of advice to give. This isn't handling it well. This is the definition of stupid. Hey Clark, do you even know what denomination this church is? Because if they're a church of Immaculate Conception, they're very pro-life. That means they probably won't look very kindly on all those fetuses you murder later on.
Krypton had its chance!
Yeah, I think you need a therapist, not a priest. Better yet, maybe 2 priests, an old one and a young one. Then there's this bit with Clark standing with his back to a stained glass portrait of Jesus. I've been wondering this for a while now, but does that even count as symbolism? I don't think it does. At what point does a symbol for a hammer stop being a symbol? Is it when I start beating you over the head with it? But seriously, you might be wondering, what's the motivation behind all this? Why is this stuff in a Superman movie at all? Well, I think it's because this movie has a bit of an agenda. First, here's a little bit of context. Turns out, Warner Brothers reached out to a Christian production company called Grace Hill Media to get Man of Steel shown early before public release to specific churches. Warner Brothers and or Grace Hill also enlisted a professional to prepare a sermon to be discussed alongside these early screenings. The sermon was titled Jesus, the Original Superhero. These congregations even had their own trailers cut that the rest of the public never got to see, and I really wish I could get my hands on. So, Superman is supposed to include everyone, and aren't movie studios usually trying to appeal to as many people as possible? Kinda makes you think there might be something more going on here, doesn't it? Well, I thought so too. For example, there's the fact that the evil Kryptonians are an allegory for the Nazis. I mean, it's pretty obvious, you don't really need me to point this out. Zod is Hitler, he's trying to save his people, he's super hostile and wants to take over Krypton, eventually Earth, in order to destroy it and recreate the perfect race and reign supreme. His plan to conquer Earth involves committing mass genocide, although Hitler's motivations in doing so were actually clearer than Zod's. There's something weird going on with this analogy though, it's also a misunderstanding. What I mean is, Zod and the other Kryptonians are presented to us as like worshipping science.
Heresy!
But in the comics, Krypton actually has a religion, and a god that they worship, whom they call Rao. The movie makes sure not to mention that though, it's kinda like they intentionally left it out because they wanted to make like the Nazi eugenics loving thing a little clearer, and I guess it'd make people a little uncomfortable to have like a conflict between Krypton's religion and Christianity. Maybe they didn't want to piss off Muslims and Jews and other folks by acting like Christianity is Earth's one real religion. So instead, they chose to offend atheists by comparing them to Nazis. Take my favorite scene in the whole movie. This is a scene that has dialogue that should go down in Guinness as being the stupidest thing ever said in a major motion picture.
The fact that you possess a sense of morality, and we do not, gives us an evolutionary advantage. And if history has proven anything, it is that evolution always wins.
Take a second to let that sink in. Do you get it? Fiora's evil because she believes in evolution, but Clark's a good guy because he believes in God, who's also his father, and he goes to priests and thinks about morality. First of all, as a member of a species that's supposed to be hundreds of thousands of years more advanced than humanity, you'd think Fiora would have at least a basic understanding of how evolution actually works. And secondly, the Nazis weren't atheists. The whole Nazi religion thing is still kind of hotly under debate, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer, but one thing's for sure, Hitler certainly borrowed a lot from Christianity, and actually seemed to think it didn't go far enough. He definitely seemed to be advocating some kind of Nazi religious ideology involving one or possibly many deities. His motivation in doing so might have been pragmatic rather than actual faith, but the point is he wasn't strictly an atheist, and he didn't really advocate strictly non-religious views. But anyway, Hitler's belief in eugenics and the Aryan race don't come from evolutionary theory. It actually comes from, or more accurately, was inspired by, the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, a story he wrote called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, involving the Übermensch, or perfect men, and funnily enough, Übermensch means Superman. See, evolution is about natural selection, in strong contrast to the term survival of the fittest, which is often wrongly attributed to Darwin. But, see, Hitler believed in unnatural selection, or man-made selection, aka eugenics, which is sort of the polar opposite, the same kind of eugenics that the Kryptonians use to doom their entire race. Taking all of these factors into consideration, the movie seems to be implying something. Basically, the movie is saying this: atheism, science, technology, and a belief in evolution only leads to evil. Nazism, brutal dictatorships, eugenics, and genocide. But belief in God and Jesus will save us. Because Superman is Jesus, who obeys the will of God, who is also his intangible ghost dad. Damn it, Bill Nye. You didn't even see the movie before you agreed to do this commercial, did you? You were only doing this to promote science. But I bought that advertising. And no, this wasn't the result of me overthinking it, looking for things to hate. This was literally the first thing I said as soon as I got out of the theater. My friends were asking, so, what did everybody think? I really could have done without all that anti-science bullshit. And they were all like, you got that too? There's an obvious agenda here. And I really can't believe this kind of crap made it into a movie in this day and age. This movie should offend everybody, not just atheists. And Superman fans.